Hello. Welcome to Apart But Together, expanding our community. This is a virtual summit hosted by the National Foreign Language Center. I'm so excited to be here. My name is Laurie Clarcq, and I'm representing Southwest Cole today. So let's start with a question. What is the purpose of language? In my classroom, the purpose of language, as used in communication, is to put a picture in the mind and/or the heart of another person. Not everybody sees a visual picture of the representation in their mental representation of what they hear and read, but a vast majority of students do. And those who don't, we have other options that we can help to support them in their ability to attach meaning to sound or meaning to text. As we go through today's presentation, you're going to be seeing this simplified chart so that we can identify the different kinds of reading to writing activities that we'll talk about in today's presentation. Our goal in the classroom is to provide an environment where our students can think in the target language. Now, I know that traditionally we have thought about the classroom as a place where students can learn to speak the language. And on the way to that, write in the language. But the truth is, what we need are students who can think in the target language. And that is a priority. The truth is, if you're not thinking in the language, then reading, writing, speaking, and listening are all extremely difficult. But I had very few courses on how to get students to think in the target language. And I assumed that the more vocabulary I gave them and the more I had them write and the more that I had them speak, that it would cement the right patterns in their head. I was about 180 degrees off on that. What we needed to do, and I spent 18 years not doing it, was putting really rich, profound, high-frequency language into their heads so they could use that to think. Then, once they're thinking in the target language, it then falls out of their mouth or off their hand. So, each of my students at the beginning of the year creates a poster with that saying on it about language. I want them to understand why we are in a language class. We're in a language class so that we can understand other people. So they each make a poster in English and in Spanish, and we keep them around the room. And I have a student whose job is to rotate hanging up different kids' posters. And so all during the year, this is a constant reminder for us of what the goal is in our classroom. And I'm able to go back and refer to it constantly. The visualization piece is one that most kids rely on, and they're used to it from the training that they've gotten as young children and in school, where we start with picture books. That's important. There's a memory trace there too, picture books, that we want to go back to. And so we often start in second language acquisition with younger students with using a lot of visuals. I think we should be doing that at every age level to remind people to let's go back to picturing what this is about. So you're also going to see during this presentation some visuals that I've used in my classroom. So you're going to have to forgive my handwriting or my lack of an accent or things that I was busy working with 30 kids and writing on the board and preparing things. But I want you to understand that what I want my students to know is that it's not the language that's important, it's the meaning of the language that's important. Because text is really a written code for spoken language. Decoding is putting text back into spoken language. So, when we see code, we realize that it's what somebody might be saying out loud put into a different format. When we look at that format and put it back in our heads or through our mouths as spoken language, that's decoding. But decoding does not necessarily mean that you're reading. Reading is not just decoding. Reading is understanding the language that you decode and getting the message from it. I'm going to say that again. Reading is understanding the language that you decode and getting the message from it. Writing going back the opposite direction, is using the code to create an understandable message. And these are pieces that I share with my students. We talk about these in class, depending on their level, in the target language or in English, because I want them to understand why we're doing what we're doing. So if we put the two of them side by side, right, this gives us an idea of what we're looking at in this presentation. We want to have students be able to understand the language represented by the code so that they can then use the code to create another understandable message. And in combining those two things, the brain is processing the codes and the messages, which is helping to develop the language in the brain. Understanding and understandable are the key words. Being able just to go from the text to something out of their mouth and read it out loud does not mean they're processing the meaning. The brain only holds on to language if it has a strong connection to the meaning. And we all know this. We've heard it a million times. I studied X, Y, and Z for so many years, but I can't do it anymore. That's because we were working with the text, but we weren't understanding the messages in the language we were working with. Now, understanding has a little bit more to do with the brain than just understanding the meaning. We also want to understand the purpose. Just understanding random phrases doesn't really cut it for the brain. The brain wants to know, what is the purpose of this? It's going through so many things at one time. It's constantly wanting to know, what should I keep and what shouldn't I keep? And when something has meaning and purpose, then it's really memorable, and the brain clings to it. So here again is our chart, and we're going to take a look at this. Now, on the left-hand side, I labeled this novice, intermediate, and advanced. And that's loosely based on ACTFL's levels, but understanding that you may have a novice student in your level 1 course and a more advanced student in your level 1 course. So if you want to look at it from that perspective, go right ahead. Just make sure you're actually matching the student's abilities with the assignment. Across the top are 3 basic ways to use reading to get writing. And yes, it can be done. Si se puede. This is an expression I like to use a lot in my classes. I want kids to know, yes, they can do it. And I love to surround them with the text that they hear all the time. So, we've talked a little bit about language and reading and writing, but what is the purpose of written language? Well, let's take a look at it practically from a student's point of view. They are asked to do a lot of things that don't seem relevant to them in the present day. So let's take a look at some reasons that it might be relevant to write in the target language. One of those is to record and then go back later to retrieve information. So if we're going to ask our students to take notes, we might want to model that for them. Also, we use that written information to share information that we've gotten somewhere else. So I could use the notes from first period to talk to my students about third period. Or if someone was absent that day, we can fill them in really quickly based on the notes we took the day before. Perhaps we have a story that we want to share, but we're afraid we'll miss some of the details, or we need the outline of it so that we can add the details later. Students like to rely on short pieces of text to help them remember what comes next in the story. I know instinctively we want to think that they're doing it as a cheat, as a crutch, but the reality of it is it's not a crutch, it's a scaffold, it's a support. They're not so concerned about whether or not they remember the words as they are concerned with remembering what comes next. And so just a hint of a word, a hint of a text, depending on their level, can be an enormous support. Written text can also be used to express thoughts and feelings. Now, at my age, we used to do that, back in the day with little notes. We used to write each other little notes all the time. But now everything's done electronically. And these kids loved to send electronic messages. And so whether you send it like this one, which eventually I created and then put up on the board for them, or they create with their little emojis on their phone, it doesn't matter. Giving them ways in the target language to express their thoughts and feelings is super powerful because that's what they want to do. The first thing kids want to talk about is what they're thinking about and what they're feeling. So let's give them that language and give them opportunities to use it. Sometimes we want to share, but we need a break from just sharing out loud or passing a paper around. And this was just an idea we used at a week-long camp, where at the end of the week, rather than have kids write me a message that they gave me on the way out the door, like a little ticket out, I had them write it on a think blob on the board and then take a picture and email it to me. And then it was really fun to be able to share those. We also use written language to organize our thoughts and ideas. And this is something that students really need to see in process. So anytime that we're going to assign something that requires a plan, we want to plan it out for them in context on the board in an example so they can see it. Many of them don't do this. This is an executive function that a lot of them haven't developed yet. So we can help them by doing that in the target language. And it's a great opportunity for input. Also, of course, okay, a great opportunity for creativity. And there are tons of students who absolutely love the opportunity to do this. So why do we want our students to write? What will we use it for once we have it? I think this is one of the most important questions to ask ourselves when it comes to writing. Because the truth is, I think 90% or more of our students just do what we ask them to do because it's for a grade. And they've been trained to do that. Don't get me wrong. We may have different ideas about that, but they've been trained by the system they're in to ask, are we getting graded for this? How much is this worth? What if I don't do it? Do I have to hand it in? They've been trained by our system to do that. So let's step back a little bit and ask ourselves, what is it we want our students to write? Why? And then what are we going to do with it once we have it? Because that makes a difference to them. I'm going to get the first one out of the way right away. The most common use of student writing is to evaluate their level of production. How well are they doing based on how well they can write? Now, that's a whole nother workshop, frankly, but I want to put that one out there that is definitely legitimate, and there's a way and a time to use that. However, it's not the best use of our class time. Writing has so many other options and so many other purposes that I want to remind you that this only really needs to be done several times over the course of 10 or 12 weeks. It doesn't need to be done once a week. Now, that doesn't mean you can't write more often. It means, are you evaluating their level of production and their ability to produce without certain numbers of errors every week? There's so many more things that we can do. So one of the great reasons to have students do writing is to vary and repeat the input. If there are messages that you want them to get in the target language, I ask kids to reproduce them. Like I said earlier, they all make a poster in English and in Spanish talking about what the purpose of language is. We also all make a poster in the target language about our rules. In this classroom, we try to respect, we try to think, we try to accept, we try to understand, we try to include. These are great messages and great high-frequency, useful vocabulary. All right, back to our little chart. We're going to start with this piece, changing a core reading. This is not new. This is something that people have done over the years, and I want to give us the opportunity to look at it a little bit deeper. Now, I'm not going to refer too much to the chart other than the fact that it's there, and you can come back and refer to it later. So the first piece is choosing a base story or creating a base story that has highly familiar vocabulary and structures. And for the most part, it needs to be short. This is not a project. We're not asking students to work on something for days at a time. This is quick, useful, productive vocabulary on a regular basis. And I use that to basic vocabulary, the high-frequency verbs, high-frequency nouns, and proper nouns to create new material for input. For me, it's what's interesting. So I often start the class with here's what's interesting today. After we've done our little, bell ringers and things that we do, the first lesson or piece of the day is what's happening, what's new. What's interesting. So this is a true story of a friend who was in the floods in Houston a couple of years ago, and a neighbor called him over because she found this gigantic fish swimming in her kitchen, and he sent me this video clip of him diving into the water. Super, super engaging. And And I held the video back until after we'd done the story. So this is very simple language I use with my level 1 students. Now, we took the story and then we did several things with it. We acted it out in the front of the class. I had a student who was Stephen and a student who was Vanessa and a student who was the fish, and we literally acted out the story in the front. Then I had the students divide up into groups of 3, and one was the Stephen, one was Vanessa, and one was the fish. And I read the story again slowly, and they acted it out in their little groups. After we'd done it in chronological order, then I randomly would pick sentences and do them out of order, just to make sure they really got the message of each sentence. The next day, I had the students tell me back the story, and I wrote it in my handwriting on the board. I think it's important for students to see handwriting, even though mine is sloppy, along with more formal text writing, because they're going to get messages from real people in real handwriting. We took the sentences they gave me back and we did some checking on what things mean and a little bit of what we call a grammar pop-up. You can see in the second sentence, the himself calls instead of calls himself, and I wanted them to see what those words meant. Has and live and house, those are high frequency words, so we wanted to point those out. One of them wanted to use the word neighbor. That's a brand new word, so we wanted to make sure that they understood the word that. And we had a native speaker in the class and she wanted to use it, and I wanted to honor that. So after we had acted it out the first day, the second day they told me the story back and we just talked about a little bit of the language. Then, and I'm giving you this in English, but they got it in Spanish. They got the story outline with blanks in it, and it was their job to create a new story, right? To fill in the blank. There's a man, a woman, an animal. His or her name is, she lives in. It's basically the same story with something slightly changed in each line. This is something a lot of us have done. Now, in the past, I would have started with this, and it wasn't always successful. In fact, it was rarely really successful. It's much more successful now that we do the main story first, because now they know that they're not looking for individual words. They're looking to create a coherent story, a complete message. Then, there are tons of things that I can do with that activity. What I did was have them hand it in, and then I typed it up and gave out different stories to different classes or different stories to different groups. And they worked together on them to make sure they understood what they meant, and then shared their illustrations. It was so fun for the kids who had written the story to see the illustrations that their peers had made for them. I also ended up using one of them a week or so later for the quiz. Now, for upper level classes, you've got to change things a little bit. So the format that we used here was sort of a mini biography, and I did one of myself, and then the students did one for themselves. Now, you may be thinking, hey, these kids are upper level. They should, be able to pull these things out for themselves. Well, in truth, that was the goal. All right. The ultimate goal was to see that you had grown in being able to talk about yourself. So I want to start with these supports. Struggling is not a support. Stretching to dig vocabulary out of your head is not a support. Talking to someone about who you are and where you come from is the goal. So this became a support. And the sentence was, when I was certain age, I learned how to do X, Y, and Z. Super helpful if your kids have all known each other for years, because a lot of things they already know, but this one was new for them. Then, after they had created the books, they were able to discuss the books and talk about them with their peers. It was very interesting to match up different kids with different partners because they tend to get together in little cliquey groups, and this is a great way to break that up. So let's go back and take a look. The process is this: input first. So here's a little story. I had my story about Stephen and his fish, but here's another example. So then once you have the input, you provide a model, like we did about grandma, and then you work with it. You do an activity with it, or preferably 2 or 3, so that they know without a doubt what each of those sentences means. Then you're going to scaffold their output for them. So I'm going to give them the original, I'm going to underline a couple of things, and then I want them to replace it. If they're an upper level group, they get to replace more. You want to make it somewhat realistic, something they can relate to. So one of the ways to do that is I give my students a little bit of bonus, a little bit of extra credit if they contact me when they are not going to be in school. And so I give them a form that they can use. This is our my level 1 form. And then they have to use the form and email it to me, and they need to add information or change information in it for them to get the extra bump of credit. Because it does take a little bit of effort to email it, but better yet if it comes out in their own words. And of course they do it in the target language. I'm just showing you the example in English. Right? So they need to add a little bit or change a little bit. And upper levels have one also. It's just more complex language. But the goal is for them to read something in order to write it. So they're getting this push of input. Now, I used to think that that was cheating. I used to think that that was just taking the words and putting them on the piece of paper. It is. It is. It's just copying if there's no purpose to the message. But if there is a real purpose to what you're writing, the brain jumps in and pays attention to it, and it becomes input instead. So we're going to take another piece here called adding to an outline. You're going to provide an outline using highly familiar vocabulary and structures. So here's our outline. The first sentence, a middle sentence, and a last sentence. I chose words that my elementary school kids that I was teaching at the time knew, so that I could just make a teeny tiny little example of a little teeny tiny story. The most difficult things for kids to do is to start. I don't know how many times over the years I've just had kids say, I don't know how to start. I don't know how to start. So unless you're evaluating how well they start a story, give them the first line and let them go. You want to see how well they can write? Give them the first line. You want to see how well they can come up with a first sentence? Then just ask for a first sentence. But don't penalize them on an entire writing just because they have trouble picking the right first sentence, especially if they're perfectionists. So they have their little outline. And one way I could go about doing this is to start, as always, modeling for the class. So we have the 3 sentences on the board or the screen, and the kids are all together in one group. We're all watching, and together we're going to build this. And I'm going to get responses by asking questions. And then they can use the answers to the questions, right, to write sentences. Now, the really most important thing here is, does the question, A, is it comprehensible? Are those words in the question things the kids understand? Because if I have to translate or make them clear, then it's really discouraging for them and we lose a lot of time. I want them right there with me, right on top of it, picturing in their head what's happening with this bug and the girl in the bug. So I'm going to ask questions that they understand. And I'm going to ask questions, this is part B, that they have the language to answer. If they don't have the language to answer it, it's not worth asking the question. So we want to make sure they have language in their brains or on a word wall or on a sheet of paper that they can use to express themselves. So imagine that as a class we come up with just 2 sentences because these were, early on novice students. And so we just came up with some easy sentences. Now, another way could have been to give them some vocabulary and add those to the sentences or create new sentences with it. Again, vocabulary that they know. I could also give them that after they've done the sentences in between. You can combine these in any way you want to. Now, don't tell me that this can't be done at the upper levels and that it's not appropriate. I used to think so. But the things that the upper level kids think about, their thinking skills, their processing skills are so much deeper that it's beautiful to see what their thoughts are and to encourage them to express their thoughts on things more powerful than renting a car or taking a picture or picking out clothes for the prom. I mean, they have some really deep thoughts, and that vocabulary is powerful and useful. So don't feel like you can't take something like this that's in English and put it in your language and see how you can scaffold kids to be able to write a much longer and deeper piece using that language. The last piece is utilizing the text. So in this first example, the project was a community builder, and it was an input-output piece where they read lines from the chapter and then took answers from the chapter, pieces from the chapter, lines from the chapter to create an advertising poster. It literally was a copying exercise, but they had to understand the message that they read in the chapter after we'd already read it to create something for another purpose. Some of you have heard of smash doodles. Here's an example of one type of smash doodle. These were level 1 students, and each student was assigned one chapter of the book. And they had certain requirements, number of sentences, number of pictures, and then they had to have their own personal response. As you can see, in order to do it, they had to go back and reread the chapter. Then once each of these was done, we put them all around the room so that they could go through, literally walk through the book. And each one has its own personal expression and evaluation. And they had a little rubric, a little checklist they used as they went along. It can be done, and it really works in the brain. When things have been done for a purpose, the brain really kicks in. So during class, when I want to know what kids are thinking or feeling, I almost always provide comprehensible input for them to use as a response. If they don't need it, they won't use it. I promise you. If they don't need it, they don't use it. But it does get them thinking in the target language. So when I gave them this one as a journal piece at the beginning of the class, they actually, almost all of them read through it to see, is this something I would write or no? Is this something that's important to me or not? Is this how I feel or not? And in doing that, they were reading, comprehending the message, evaluating the message, making a personal response for the message, and then making a personal choice on the message, which is really thinking in the target language. Then each student chose 3 of theirs, and we could use it for a discussion or a longer writing. Another way to do this is to have students choose X number of sentences from a chapter or a reading and write them in order so they create a summary. They can't obviously take the first 10 sentences, or they won't get a summary of the entire story. They have to pick and choose of what adds to the story and what is a legitimate sentence to do. Again, we model this as a class first before they do it in small groups, before they do it on their own. And then they're illustrated. I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to model writing together so that when they're in small groups, they can support each other, so that when they do it individually, they can go back to those. I also can't enforce enough how important it is for them to actually write for a reason. In this case, half the class didn't seem to be enjoying the book, so I wanted input from them on a little ticket out. Do you want to keep reading this book? Why or why not? And use language that they already knew. Or, for example, in the case of boring and bothers me, I put the Spanish and the English so that they could express that if they wanted to. But everything else was something they absolutely knew. Eventually, we know they're going to have to go from the known to the unknown, from reading things where they understand most of it to where they don't. That's all right. The stronger their known is, the easier that will be. And I want to spend my time growing their known base so that when they get to the unknown, they have greater skill. And meeting your students where they are is the only way to get them to go farther. As much as we'd like them to be at point Z, if they're only at F or G, we've got to meet them there and walk them across a bridge. They're not going to jump off a cliff. So give them tasks at their level of production to move them forward. Model the task, scaffold the task, and then celebrate the results. So really quickly, because I don't have much time left, here is the introduction to a song by Mark Anthony, and it's a spoken piece. And he's talking about himself. What is your legacy? And so we happened to be doing that song about the time that Kobe Bryant passed. And so as a class, we did one for Kobe Bryant based on the model that Mark Anthony had done for himself, filling in the blanks. And then my students got to pick someone individually that they wanted to write for. And it was a beautiful celebration of what they were able to understand from the Mark Anthony song to connect it to something that had happened in their life that was affecting them, the death of Kobe Bryant, and then bringing it more personally home to somebody they wanted to honor. So get them to read to write, and don't feel bad about it. It's a great way to get the brain engaged, and the more the brain is engaged, the more the student is engaged, the more the language that will be acquired. Thank you so much for this time. And the National Foreign Language Center thanks you too for being part of the 2020 Summit. I hope you enjoy all of the presentations.